One of the worst things that you can do in Marvel Rivals is to look at the scoreboard. As funny as that sounds, the scoreboard in Marvel Rivals is used by literally everyone to often judge other players. While it's important mid matches, it's also a good indicator of individuals and whether they played up to standard. While the scoreboard is nice to look at and it gives a basic understanding of someone's impact, it outright doesn't tell the nuance. Low heals doesn't mean that you're not playing your part. High damage doesn't mean you're not adding value. And the damage blocked is arbitrary in the long run. Furthermore, there are these things called invisible stats. Damage resist doesn't show up on the scoreboard. Overhealth shows in damage blocked, but on characters like Ultron and Fantastic who give out overshield, it doesn't give them credit for that overshield. Distractions and time on point contesting don't show up either. While things like canceling ults and stuns have nuance to them that makes it hard to tell if they're valuable, even if a number was shown, essentially the scoreboard isn't perfect. In this video, I'll first talk about the current stats and why you shouldn't always assume they tell the whole story. Then we'll talk about the stats that are important to the game and would be nice to have. And finally, a quick overview of what stats I think should be shown at the end of the game and how the scoreboard can be better. So the first is the current stats. In game, we only have a few stats to focus on, that being deaths, KOs, and assists. KOs you get from doing any amount of damage to any enemy that dies within a certain period of time. If anything, this just shows good target prio or good AoE damage. The reason this isn't super important is because it depends on your character. This stat becomes more or less important. As most supports, you can even go many games with only a few KOs. In reality, though, a good rule of thumb is for everyone to have a fairly even KOs because this would mean that target priority is on point. Secondly, do not immediately assume a DPS is doing bad simply because their KOs are low. After all, they could have more finals, or they might just have more single target damage, or they may be a character that's more focused on distractions or simply putting pressure where it's needed. As such, it's important to note that KOs aren't everything in this game. Though they're important, many characters have different roles that they play in the game other than stat farming this KO stat. The next stat is deaths. Deaths are likely one of the most important stats in the game as a first indicator of problems. After all, this stat more or less tells you who's struggling the most. If your support is dying a lot, then you know that there could be a problem there, and maybe they need assistance. This is a good indicator to allow you to know where either you're needed to assist and help others, or it's just a skill issue on that person's part. However, I'll also point out that more important than deaths is who dies first in an engagement. After all, you might have the least amount of deaths on your team, but if you're the one that dies first before any fight actually starts happening, then it could be in large part your fault that the team is falling apart. Because after all, a Spider-Man can die like 6 times in the time that you die once, for example, but if you die and the entire team falls apart, clearly you might be carrying, but like it's when you die in the fight that is important. Finally, assists do nothing for you mid-match in reality. This stat in of itself genuinely tells you nothing in terms of like tracking ults or understanding who's like carrying the other team or the like. It just doesn't do much for you. Assists are cool and all, but they're way more for supports to get credit for kills without actually dealing damage and adding to their KO stat. But some supports don't even use the assist stat. But in reality, the assist just doesn't do much. Of course, there's also characters like Storm who also, farm the number more or less, as literally just being inside of her circle counts as an assist for her. At the very least, though, it's a visual way to represent someone's value, even if there are not, or even if they are not getting a lot of KOs. Therefore, while the stat is not super important, I appreciate its existence as it allows to show value from individuals who do not just stat farm KOs, for example. Then the second part is the after match scoreboard. So after the game ends, there is going to be more information given. It shows a wider picture. So, first, final blows are fairly important as they are the make or break for your team winning fights. But some characters are final blow merchants. Characters like, as funny as it might sound, and I tend to use her a lot, but Black Widow are more or less final blow merchants in the sense that they do a huge chunk of damage, and if you can hit your shots, so any damage that goes out, they will likely be the one to finish them off. Of course, there's other examples, but the main idea is that a DPS with less finals doesn't always mean that they're not valuable. Similar to the KO stat in that sense. Final blows being more important does carry more weight than KOs. Therefore, even though it doesn't mean that they aren't giving value, it is a stat that the DPS rule should be aiming for. The next stat is the damage stat itself. It's cool in concept, and I mean, it's always nice whenever you have the most damage in the game, but it's hard to say whether it's good or bad. After all, 9 times out of 10, it is the stat of how much ult charge you gave to the enemy supports. When your damage stat spikes, you mayhaps get your ult many times, but without final blows, that stat doesn't mean anything. And in fact, it means the opposite, that you just fed damage to the enemy team. Of course, there are two parts to this because first, there is almost no way of telling if all that damage went to helping get kills, which can likely be seen through KOs, or the second, which really has no way of telling whether your damage kept them from pushing. Of course, though, even if you kept them from pushing by feeding ult charge to them, it allows them to push with their ult the next time. So even though you can let loose a ton of damage and keep them at bay for a little bit, it does inevitably mean without final blows, they get their ult and can push easier. The next stat is damage blocked. It's another strange one. First, it's mainly for tanks. And in terms of determining its value, there's a couple of ways to look at this. First is whether your deaths are still low enough for the damage blocked to be valuable. Because you might have the most damage blocked in the game, but if you've got like 20 deaths, then that doesn't really mean much in the long run. And the second is whether the damage blocked was feeding ult charge. After all, shields and overshields don't give enemies ult charge, but just your health taking damage does give the enemies ult charge. So what I mean by this is you might have a lot of damage blocked, but if you were just standing out in the open, you were more or less just giving the enemy team ult charge. Whereas if you were like Strange weaving your shield, then it's a little bit less so because a lot of that damage blocked goes to your shield's damage blocked, which does not give the enemy ult charge. The other part of this stat is that simply put, some characters are bound to do it better. Characters like Groot require the enemy to shoot his walls, which isn't technically him blocking damage half of the time. And it's just another way for him to pad the stat and farm it, with characters like Angela and Cap, for example, doing the opposite. They don't need this stat to be high because they offer so much more to their kit through essentially causing distractions and simply bopping and weaving. They are able to offer more than a Groot who throws out some walls, which the enemies end up inadvertently shooting at in an attempt to close the gap. Well, I'm not saying that Groot's walls are bad and that Groot shouldn't be throwing up walls. Instead, what I'm saying is that Groot is bound to have more damage blocked than some of these more off tanks because by nature that's what he does. Essentially, what I mean by this is a Groot should not be saying he did his job because he has high damage blocked, because he will always have high damage blocked unless the enemy team is simply just bad and not willing to shoot the walls. The last part of the damage block stat are the two support offenders that make it hard to tell the value of damage blocked. This being Invis Woman and White Fox, who generate a shield, with White Fox is literally almost always being destroyed since it is not something that she can like take down. So once it's put up, it just stays there for a bit of time, meaning that you'll casually every like 10 seconds get an extra 200 damage block. This is simply one of those things where it's hard to tell the full extent of the value that these two damage blocks give, as there's no real way to tell how valuable those shields were in reality, because a lot of the time just throwing out shields until it breaks doesn't necessarily mean it's good damage block. Moving on to the next stat, there is the support stat, healing. This one is heavily relied on by DPS and tank players to judge their supports by. If your healing isn't high enough, you are the problem. Which in reality, this is half the problem with looking at the scoreboard, since there's so much nuance to this stat, especially. First, you must determine, does the character have a healing circle? After all, many ults in this game are defined by being circles of healing for supports. If so, and your character has a healing circle, essentially what happens is anytime they press the Q button, they casually can get 200 plus healing per second for each ally sent in that area. Meaning that throughout the entire span of the ult, you can casually get 5 to 10,000 healing every time you ult. So that means characters like C&D, Invis Woman, and Luna, as they're the greatest examples, all casually, when they click Q, get a large chunk of healing to their stat, kind of padding the stat a little bit, making it look better for free. Sure, it keeps your team alive during that time, but like the inflation of the stat very much distorts people's view on some characters. After all, even though Jeff now has a healing circle, a lot of people will look at a Jeff and they will immediately assume that he is a bad support because he's got 20,000 less healing than the Luna. When in reality, the difference was that Luna clicked Q and made that difference within 2-3 ults. The second question that you must ask, however, is how is their neutral healing? After all, some characters do just straight up have great neutral healing. As mentioned, Jeff, and especially Rocket, have great neutral healing with minimal effort. Thus, their healing could reasonably be high, but it's rarely ever going to be as high, or at least consistently high, as characters with support ults, healing circles. And what about the others, though? Other supports may not get super high healing because they simply add more to their gameplay. Another quick point is that heal boost effects do not give credit to those who boosted the healing, so characters like Gambit and Jeff often don't have the highest healing, but consistently offer the healing boost. Characters like Deadpool offer quick ultimates, White Fox offers distractions and CCs, Atom offers burst healing, while Ultron offers consistent healing at the cost of it being low, though he is also kind of a healing farmer with his consistency of healing and ultimate. Nonetheless, essentially, healing is good to look at, but understanding first the nuance of which characters should be getting high heals as compared to what their character offers is important. A White Fox with 20k less healing than an Invis doesn't mean they didn't fulfill their role, especially when you look at triple support, for example, because then that very much shifts the healing stat because it allows one support, for example, to often be more of a DPS in that sense. Nonetheless, the last stat is kind of useless, that being accuracy. As you can tell everybody's accuracy at the end of the match. It's quite strange. Obviously, this is not very important and kind of comedic with characters like C&D who have auto aim and melee characters who accuracy is weird to gauge. After all, I do many games with Black Panther and I end up with a 3% accuracy when I had a like 80% refresh rate on my Spirit Rend, but nonetheless, it's simply because I just hold down my primary attack the entire game. In the end, though, this stat is mildly important for hit scan and some projectile characters, as it does more or less tell you how effective they were with that role. In the end, though, you can have low accuracy and still end up with a good amount of final blows and damage, in large part because of the fire rate of many of these heroes, with characters like Hela and Phoenix shooting almost or a little more than twice a second, even making it not as important to hit your shots as long as you hit the important shots, and if that makes sense. Of course, the higher your accuracy, the better you're going to do, though, so it is still a fairly reasonable stat to take into consideration. The next section of this video is invisible stats. As mentioned, this is a two-parter in the sense some stats are shown only to you, and you cannot even see them once the game is done. And the second are the truly invisible stats. So first, the self-known stats. Whenever you're in a game and you open up the scoreboard, underneath everyone else's stats, there's a section that shows your own personal stats. The first problem is that only you can see these stats, and in reality, they mean nothing when only you can see them. Plus, when the game ends, there's no way to look at those stats. Not to go over everyone, but here are a few. Black Widow's electroplasma accuracy and her headshot accuracy. Psylocke's wing shuriken accuracy and her ult KOs, Jeff's hide and seek distance, and specifically his devour, not KOs with his ult, just eating people, Black Panther's spirit rend refresh and shields generated, Thor's storm surge knockups, Venom's cellular corrosion detonations, Blade's scarlet shroud damage reduction, and so on. Many of these are examples of just stats that the game does know, but there's no actual way to see them after the game. And it's not like you can see your teammates' stats either. So all this is for your own ability to look at. You can be like, oh yeah, I got my refresh rate on Spirit Rend is really good, but that doesn't mean anything to anyone else on your team because they can't see it. The next part is damage reduction. It's an actual invisible stat, so it's strange to really understand. With one character that being most notable for this at the moment, that being the Thing, as he is, if I'm not mistaken, one of the only characters that actually gives damage reduction to the team. But the problem is that damage resist isn't very notable. And the main reason that is because damage resist robs you of the damage block stat. Whenever you would take 100 damage, but you have a 30% damage reduction, the stat will say you only blocked 70. So how exactly can you tell its value if it's not shown? The next invisible stat is heal boost. As mentioned before, there's just no way of showing how much healing you boosted or how much of someone else's healing is from your boosted healing. Some more invisible stats are speed boost. With multiple supports having speed boost, there's no actual way to check the value that comes from this, and there's not even a way that it has written in the game where you speed boost it. Obviously, in a sense, assists are affected by speed boost, so it is somewhat there. Another invisible stat is distraction. Simply put, there's no way to calculate this one, but a good BP might not have crazy final blows, but he will be distracting the enemy team long enough for your team to push. Otherwise, things like heal reduction, contesting cart in overtime could be options that have a more noticeable impact on the scoreboard, as you can easily show off how many KOs were got because somebody was heal reduced, or maybe just having a stat that shows how much time is spent on cart. Moving on, though, what do I think a new scoreboard should or could look like? So mid game, I feel like it is in a decent enough spot, but can also use some of these adjustments. It's largely difficult to adjust this one, as it is the most important to look at stats mid-game, and it's very difficult to directly share stats that would more or less give the enemy team too much of an insight. Of course, games like Overwatch have this, so it is reasonably possible to think that at some point we would be able to actually see everyone's healing and damage mid game. But at the same time, I kind of like how it's not directly shown until the end of the match, personally. But one thing is that you can easily add personal stats, the little section at the bottom by your character when you click tab. If there was a way to scroll between your team, I think that would be a very nice touch to this in game scoreboard. In terms of the after game one, this is the big one. First, I want there to be 3 tabs, allowing you to scroll between all 3. The beginning tab would stay more or less the same, like the original stat layout. However, the second page would be the more nuanced stats, like how much Doctor Strange's shield's damage blocked specifically, or how much damage was blocked with overhealth, or how much heal boost you did, or how much heal boost you received, if you canceled ults, or if you contested point in overtime. Most of these could just be like scrollable sections that take from some of the personal stats from the mid game. The third page would just be the more personal stats that you can scroll through everyone's personal stats, see how much they refresh their spirit rend or how well they timed their blade's scarlet shroud. However, the second idea is rather than the multiple tabs, you can just have an option to hover over a selected stat that would give you a breakdown. For example, if you hovered over heals, it would allow you to see how much was healed by whom and how much came from your ultimate. So what it might look like is a little either like pie chart or just straight numbers. But whenever you hovered over healing, you could see, for example, like 20k healing, and then a section next to that would say 10k from her ultimate, and then another section might say like 2000 from the heal boost that Jeff's bubbles give. Would be a simple way of doing it. Another example is with damage blocked. You could do similarly with damage reduction. For example, you could have a section that says this is how much damage you would have taken without damage reduction, and then another section that would say this is how much was dealt to overhealth, and this is how much that was dealt to like deployable items like shields. Obviously, I don't know how difficult this would be, but I definitely think this would be a great option, especially because characters like Ultron would get to shine with their overhealth. How he gives overhealth, there could be a section of your damage blocked where it says you this much of your damage blocked is because of Ultron's overhealth that he gave you. In conclusion, I simply find that the nuance is required for anyone who looks at the stats. It is far too easy for the majority of players to see a low stat and blame their team, completely ignoring that there is more to this game than what the scoreboard says. As such, we went through what some of the current stats mean, talking about how statflation works, and how some characters are designed to offer more to the game than their role's given stat, such as healing. Things like damage mean nothing without kills and often mean feeding enemy support ult charge. Damage blocked often being nonsensical with some characters like Groot who require the enemy to shoot walls when not placed to directly block damage. And supports easily inflate their stats with ults and often offer some of their most invisible stats to the team. In terms of invisible stats, we discussed 2 types. First is the personal stats that appear on your scoreboard mid-game, but only to you. And the second are actual stats that do not get shown anywhere or straight cannot be given numbers. Some of the changes that I'd like to see is first offering the option to look at everyone's personal stats mid. And the second is to allow a more in-depth look at the stat breakdown and notable stats like time on point, time contested, damage resist, and a breakdown of stats that help determine whether that stat is inflated by showing how much heals were done by heal boosts or if it came from an ultimate, and so on. In the end, I hope you all enjoyed this yap about stats and the scoreboard. Feel free to drop your thoughts below whether my points were valid, and if there are any stats in particular you wish you could judge people on at the end of the game. Furthermore, check out some of my character concept videos as we design and walk through what some characters could look like when added to Rivals, with the next one being Nightcrawler. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one, and have a good one.